I still remember the way the words hung in the air like poison. My brother-in-law Daniel leaned back in his chair at my father's will reading. Eyes narrowed, lips curling with that cold smirk he always wore when he thought he was winning. "You will get nothing." He sneered, his voice low enough to sting, but loud enough that everyone in the room heard it. My heart clenched, not because of what he said, but because of the absolute certainty with which he said it, as if my father's words did not matter, as if the lawyer was wasting his time, as if Daniel had already written the script, and we were only actors forced to play our parts. The room smelled of old wood and lilies, a suffocating reminder of the funeral that had taken place just hours before. Family members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some pretending not to have heard him, others glancing toward me with a mixture of pity and warning. My mother sat at the far end of the table, her hands trembling as she folded and unfolded the handkerchief in her lap. Beside her, my sister Evelyn stared down at her folded hands, refusing to meet my eyes. Evelyn had long since learned the price of contradicting her husband. I opened my mouth to respond, but something else caught my attention. The heavy oak doors at the back of the room stood wide open. The air from the corridor drifted in cool and unsettling, carrying the faint echo of footsteps outside. The lawyer had asked Daniel to close the doors before the reading began to preserve privacy, to maintain decorum, but Daniel had waved him off with a dismissive flick of his hand. Now I realized he had deliberately kept them unlatched. A prickle ran up my spine. I looked at him closely at the way his eyes darted toward the hallway, at the faint twitch in his jaw. My instincts screamed that something was wrong. I whispered, "Daniel, shut the doors. People are walking by." He gave me a mocking smile and shook his head slowly, savoring my unease. "We have nothing to fear, Rachel," he said smoothly, his voice oily with false confidence. "This is my house now." The lawyer cleared his throat and continued reading, trying to restore order, but I could barely hear the words. My pulse thundered in my ears. My gaze flicked between the open doors and Daniel's rigid figure. Something about his refusal gnawed at me, an unease I could not silence. My cousin leaned toward me, murmuring that maybe he should go shut them, but before he could rise, Daniel slammed his hand down on the table. "Stay seated. No one moves until this is done." His tone was sharp, commanding, the kind of tone that did not invite argument. And then it happened. The first shot rang out from the corridor, a piercing crack that split the air like lightning. The sound reverberated through the chamber, shattering the pretense of civility. Screams erupted instantly. The lawyer dropped his papers, his face draining of color. My mother gasped and clutched her chest, her handkerchief fluttering to the floor. Chairs screeched against the wood as relatives scrambled to their feet. Another shot followed, louder, closer, echoing against the marble walls. The hallway exploded with chaos, the unmistakable pounding of boots, the ragged cries of people scattering. I froze my breath, caught in my throat. It was real. A shooting. At my father's will reading. My eyes flew to Daniel. He did not look surprised. His jaw tightened, but his gaze was steady, almost expectant. While everyone else lurched toward the doors in blind panic, he remained seated, arms folded, blocking the path like a sentinel. He barked, "Sit down. Do not move." His voice was sharp, forceful, cutting through the screams. For a moment, it was as though the chaos outside did not exist, as though he wanted us trapped exactly where we were. That was when I knew. The refusal to lock the doors had not been laziness. It had not been arrogance. It had been deliberate. He had wanted them open. He had wanted this. My name is Rachel Carter. I am 30 years old, and until that day, I had always thought of myself as someone who could endure the dysfunction of my family without being swallowed by it. My father, Charles Carter, had been the anchor of our household, a man whose authority was stern, but whose presence provided a kind of stability we could lean on. He built a legacy that stretched from farmland in the countryside to a successful manufacturing company in the city. When he died, a fragile order collapsed with him. The will reading was supposed to be about closure, about dividing his life's work among his children, but instead it became a battleground and the stage for something darker. My mother, Margaret, was fragile, a woman in her 60s who had spent her life trying to smooth conflicts with silence and compromise. She sat at that table wringing her handkerchief like a rosary, too weak to challenge anyone too weary to stop the inevitable storm. My older sister Evelyn had been the bright star, once beautiful and clever, but years of marriage to Daniel had ground her into a shadow. She barely spoke without looking at him first. Her silence was the silence of survival, a silence born of control and fear. My brother Mark was the opposite of Daniel, passive to a fault. A man who believed conflict could always be avoided if you just stepped aside. He was a good man at heart, but weak, too weak, to protect our mother or confront Evelyn's suffering, too weak to recognize that silence can be as dangerous as violence. Then there was Daniel, the outsider, who had forced himself into the heart of the Carter family. From the beginning, he had worn authority like armor, always positioning himself as the provider, the protector, the man of the house, even though the house was not his. He married my sister, but treated her like property. He ridiculed me as if I were an intruder in my own family, and he looked at my father's company and land with the hunger of a predator. His control was not only over Evelyn, but over the narrative itself. He twisted every moment into proof of his superiority, every gesture into a claim that we owed him obedience. Growing up in the same house as my sister, I had seen bruises she tried to hide. I had heard muffled sobs behind closed doors, but she always insisted she was fine. We all knew Daniel's temper. We all knew his words cut like blades, and yet no one confronted him because he wrapped his cruelty in the language of responsibility. He said he was protecting Evelyn, guiding her, leading the family. In reality, he was conquering us piece by piece. The funeral had been a theater of grief, but behind every hug and tear there was calculation. Cousins whispered about who would get the farmland. Uncles speculated about the company shares, and Daniel lingered near the casket like a king surveying his throne. I felt sick watching him accept condolences with that smug smile, his hand resting firmly on Evelyn's shoulder as though she were furniture. I tried to remind myself that the will reading would set everything straight. My father had promised fairness, had promised that all of us would be remembered. But when Daniel sneered, "You will get nothing," it struck deeper than just an insult. It was a revelation of how he viewed us all as obstacles to be crushed. In that moment, the memory of my childhood came back to me, nights when I hid in my room listening to my parents argue about letting Daniel into the business, my father insisting no outsider should control Carter, and my mother pleading for peace. My father had stood firm then, but now he was gone, and Daniel saw his chance. The atmosphere before the will reading had been heavy. Relatives gathered in clusters whispering about Daniel's influence over Evelyn, about whether my father might have left provisions that allowed him indirect control. Every look toward me carried both sympathy and dismissal. As the unmarried daughter, I had always been treated as an afterthought, someone expected to endure quietly while the men handled the legacy. But I was no longer a girl in her 20s trying to find her place. I had built my own career, had carved a life outside of Daniel's shadow, and I came into that room determined not to be erased. Still, the tension pressed on me like a weight. I could feel Daniel's eyes even before the lawyer opened the folder. His gaze was steady, challenging a warning that whatever the paper said, the outcome would be his to decide. That was who Daniel was. He thrived on control, and control was the only language he understood. As I sat there surrounded by the Carter family, I realized that this was not just a legal proceeding. It was a test, a confrontation between the ghost of my father's authority and the brute force of Daniel's ambition. And when the gunfire erupted, when chaos shattered the illusion of safety, the mask slipped from his face, and the truth began to show. He had not come to witness the will. He had come to ensure his dominance survived my father's death. The hours leading up to the reading of the will were suffocating. The funeral had barely ended, and already the undercurrent of greed and rivalry ran beneath every polite exchange. I could feel it in the way certain cousins lingered too close to the lawyer, in the way uncles speculated about land divisions as if my father's body had not yet been laid to rest. It was as if grief had a price tag and everyone was eager to see their share. Daniel moved through the room like a conductor, his presence controlling the rhythm of every conversation. He whispered in Evelyn's ear, his hand heavy on her back, guiding her steps like she was a puppet on strings. He spoke loudly about how he had managed Carter finances in recent years, how Evelyn would need his guidance more than ever. I wanted to shout that he had done nothing of the sort, that my father had never let him near the real accounts, but the others nodded politely, as if his authority were unquestionable. My mother kept avoiding my eyes, her lips trembling each time Daniel spoke. She knew better than anyone what he was capable of, but her survival strategy had always been silence. My brother Mark busied himself pouring coffee, pretending not to hear the subtle insults Daniel aimed my way. I had been reduced to the role of observer, the invisible daughter who was expected to sit quietly and let the men decide. The truth was that I had never been silent, not as a child, not as an adult, but every time I tried to speak against Daniel, he found a way to twist my words into disrespect. He thrived on humiliating me in front of others. At dinner tables, he would mock my career choices, call me naive for not marrying rich, sneer that I was chasing independence because no man wanted me. Evelyn would sit beside him with her lips pressed together, her eyes cast down, enduring it as if she were enduring rain. The memory of those dinners clung to me as I watched him strut about the parlor that afternoon, his arrogance swelling in the vacuum my father's death had left. When the lawyer finally called us together to sit at the long oak table, Daniel positioned himself directly across from me. His stare was deliberate, challenging, as if daring me to contest him. Evelyn sat next to him, her fingers intertwined tightly, knuckles pale, while Mark took the seat beside me, offering a faint smile that was meant to reassure, but only deepened my sense of isolation. The lawyer began with formalities, his voice measured, but the air was already electric. Every word he read seemed to hang in the balance, every pause filled with the weight of expectation. Daniel interrupted twice with smug questions about specific assets, ignoring the lawyer's irritation. He was not listening for details. He was performing, reminding us that he believed himself untouchable. I caught my mother's eye at one point and saw tears glistening. She shook her head slightly as if to warn me to stay quiet to endure. But my stomach twisted in rebellion. This was not just about inheritance. It was about dignity, about refusing to let Daniel turn my father's legacy into his personal conquest. And yet, the room remained trapped under his shadow. Every cough, every shuffle of paper, every sigh was punctuated by his looming presence. I could feel the anger simmering under my skin, but before I could decide how to confront him, the first sharp sound from the corridor cracked through the air and everything shifted from tension to terror. The moment the first sound reached us, it was faint, a distant echo like wood splitting or glass shattering, but within seconds it repeated sharper, louder, unmistakable. Gunfire! The polished chamber where the will was being read fell into stunned silence as every head turned toward the wide-open doors Daniel had refused to close. My heart hammered against my ribs. I wanted to leap up, to rush forward and push those heavy oak doors shut, but Daniel's sudden movement froze me. He stood quickly, his chair scraping across the floor, and positioned himself directly in front of the entrance, not to protect us, but to keep the doors from closing. The lawyer stammered, trying to continue reading as if nothing had happened, but his hands shook and the papers rustled violently. Another burst of shots rang out in the corridor, followed by the unmistakable scream of someone in pain. My cousin gasped and half rose from her seat, but Daniel's hand slammed against the doorframe and his voice cut across the panic like a whip. "Stay seated. No one moves." His command was not reassurance. It was a threat. The words rattled through me because they echoed so many nights when he had spoken to Evelyn in that same cold tone. More footsteps thundered in the hallway, shouts from strangers, the crash of something heavy falling. The air in the chamber seemed to thin, pressing against my chest until every breath felt like a battle. I looked at Evelyn, hoping for some sign of resistance, but she only stared at her lap, trembling. I whispered to Mark that we needed to shut the doors to protect everyone. But before he could respond, Daniel glared at him with such intensity that my brother shrank back into his chair. The lawyer finally dropped all pretense of composure, his voice breaking as he urged everyone to move towards safety. But Daniel barked again. "Stay where you are!" his tone rising with the chaos. The smell of gunpowder drifted into the room now, acrid and metallic, carried by the draft through the open doors. My instincts screamed at me to act. Every fiber of my being told me that sitting still meant waiting to die. My cousins were whispering prayers, my mother was clutching her chest. Evelyn was frozen in terror, and through it all, Daniel stood tall, defiant, as if he had orchestrated the very nightmare unfolding outside. I rose from my chair, my knees weak, but my resolve stronger than my fear. Daniel's eyes snapped to me, his mouth curling into that cruel half-smile. "Sit down, Rachel." His voice was lower now, dangerous. I shook my head, feeling the weight of every childhood memory of his cruelty pressing me forward rather than holding me back. I moved toward the side corridor that led to the kitchen, motioning for the younger cousins to follow. A sudden crack of gunfire exploded closer than ever, fragments of plaster showering from the hallway wall. Screams erupted in the chamber as panic finally shattered obedience. People surged toward the back of the room. Daniel lunged, blocking the main exit, yelling about order, about staying put, but the tide had shifted. My mother cried out my name. My brother stumbled after me, and in the chaos, a lamp crashed to the floor, sending shards of glass skittering across the wood. The sound seemed to drown Daniel's voice for a moment, and in that moment, we broke free. I grabbed my mother's arm, pulling her toward the narrow corridor, my heart slamming in terror, adrenaline flooding me. Behind us, I heard Daniel's furious voice shouting that we were hysterical, that running would only bring danger, but I no longer cared. I knew in my bones that staying meant surrendering control to him, and control was the one thing I could never allow him again. The world collapsed into a storm of noise and fear the instant we broke from the table. Gunfire echoed like thunder rolling through the corridor, each shot jolting my body as if the bullets were tearing through the walls of the house and into our very bones. I dragged my mother down the narrow passage toward the kitchen, my breath ragged, my hand slippery with sweat as I clutched her trembling fingers. Behind me, Mark stumbled, his face pale, his eyes wide with confusion, while two of our cousins clung to each other, their sobs muffled against the roar of chaos. The lawyer shouted for order, but his voice was swallowed by the pounding of feet and the shrill cries of relatives scrambling to survive. When we reached the kitchen door, I shoved it open with my shoulder, heart pounding, eyes darting to every corner for a possible exit. The back door loomed across the room, heavy and bolted, a promise of escape. I rushed toward it, but froze when I heard Daniel's voice roaring behind us, commanding everyone to sit down, calling us cowards, his tone so steady it made the terror feel surreal. Even as gunfire raged, he was insisting on obedience, his figure blocking the oak doors of the main chamber like a dark sentinel determined to keep his captives in place. My cousins hesitated, their upbringing pulling them toward authority, even when authority meant danger. I turned to them sharply and shouted, "Do you want to live or do you want to obey him?" The words cut through their paralysis. They followed me, their tears streaking their faces as they stumbled across the tiled floor. Another shot exploded closer now, a window in the dining hall shattering, as if to remind us how fragile the barrier between life and death truly was. I reached the bolt on the back door and yanked it upward, my fingers trembling, the metal scraping in protest. At last, it clicked free. I pushed the door open to the yard, the cool air rushing against my face like salvation. For a moment, the world outside seemed impossibly quiet compared to the storm behind us. But then, more screams split the air, and I realized safety was still distant. I guided my mother and the younger cousins out first, my heart hammering. We crouched low, moving along the side of the house, our footsteps crunching against gravel that seemed far too loud. I wanted to keep going to run for the trees beyond the driveway, but a piercing cry from inside dragged me back. Someone was still trapped. I turned and saw through the kitchen doorway that one of the youngest cousins, a boy of 13, had stumbled and fallen near the dining room entrance. His arm was bleeding where glass had sliced him, and he was crawling helplessly while Daniel loomed above him, shouting for him to get back to his chair. Fury surged through me, hot and sharp. I sprinted back inside, ignoring the danger, sliding across the tile to reach the boy. I grabbed him under the arm and pulled him toward the kitchen, ignoring Daniel's shout, his voice venomous, calling me hysterical and disobedient. The boy whimpered, but I held firm, dragging him until we reached the doorway. Daniel lunged as if to stop us, but at that moment, another burst of shots cracked from the hall and he flinched just long enough for us to escape his grasp. Back in the yard, I tore a strip from my sleeve and wrapped it around the boy's arm, pressing hard to stop the bleeding. He cried, but nodded when I told him to stay quiet. My mother stroked his hair, her own face white with terror, but her hands steady with the instinct of survival. Mark appeared behind us, carrying one of the smaller children, his usual weakness burning away under the raw demand of the moment. For the first time, I saw in him a glimmer of strength, and it gave me hope. We moved toward the garage at the edge of the property, crouching behind hedges whenever footsteps or shouts drew too near. Each second stretched into eternity, my ears straining for the direction of the gunfire, my eyes scanning for any movement that might mean another threat. Every shadow seemed alive, every creak of wood a warning. Yet through the fear, a strange clarity formed. Daniel had wanted us vulnerable. He had wanted us contained. By resisting, by moving, by choosing action over obedience, we had turned his plan on its head. At the garage, I ushered everyone inside and closed the door softly behind us. The smell of oil and dust filled the air. We crouched between old crates and the rusting lawnmower, huddled together, breathing in short gasps. Someone began to pray softly, the words trembling but persistent, while another stifled sobs against her sleeve. I pressed my ear to the thin window, hearing the chaos still raging at the main house. The shots were fewer now, but closer, deliberate, not random. I knew then that this was not chance, not some wandering act of violence. It was targeted, orchestrated, and Daniel's refusal to close the doors had been no accident. He had wanted the shooter to have access. He had wanted us trapped. I looked at my family, at my mother's weary face, at the terrified children, at Mark's unsteady resolve, and I made a vow that if we survived this, I would no longer let Daniel define the fate of the Carter family. Survival was no longer just instinct. It was defiance. When the gunfire finally ceased, the silence was almost worse, a heavy emptiness that pressed on our ears and hearts. Police sirens wailed in the distance, and soon the yard was flooded with flashing lights, voices shouting commands, officers with weapons drawn. They moved us out of the garage one by one, their hands steady but firm, telling us to keep our heads down and our hands visible. My mother clung to my arm, trembling but alive, while Mark carried the boy whose arm I had bandaged. The younger cousins were pale and wide-eyed, but still breathing. I looked back toward the main house and saw Daniel standing on the porch with his arms folded as if he had been a spectator rather than a participant. His expression was controlled cold, not the face of a man who had just survived chaos, but the face of someone annoyed that his plan had been interrupted. At the hospital, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead while nurses moved quickly from bed to bed. My mother was treated for shock, the boy's arm stitched, and wrapped Mark, given oxygen for hyperventilation. I sat in the waiting room staring at my hands, the smell of antiseptic sharp in my nose, trying to process what had just happened. Reporters were already gathering outside, cameras flashing against the glass, voices calling questions we could not answer. The police began taking statements. A detective with a tired face and steady eyes asked me to recount every detail. I told him about the will reading, about Daniel refusing to lock the doors, about his command for everyone to stay seated even when the gunfire started. The detective scribbled notes, but his expression gave nothing away. When I finished, he asked if Daniel had shown fear or panic. No, I said quietly. He looked prepared. He looked like he wanted it. The detective tapped his pen, considering, then moved on to question the others. My brother's voice shook as he admitted he had obeyed Daniel at first out of habit. My mother repeated over and over that Daniel had said we had nothing to fear. Evelyn arrived later, escorted by an officer. Her face was blotched from crying, but her eyes darted nervously. She sat next to Daniel in the waiting room, his hand heavy on her shoulder, guiding her like always. When the detective questioned her, she insisted Daniel had done nothing wrong, that he was only trying to maintain calm. She clutched his hand as she spoke. Her words rushed, desperate, and I felt a pang of pity mixed with rage. She was defending him because she had been conditioned to, because survival for her meant loyalty, no matter the cost. After hours of chaos, the hospital quieted, but inside me the storm raged louder than ever. The official story on the news was already circulating. Unknown gunman disrupts funeral family shaken but alive. No mention of Daniel's refusal to close the doors, no mention of his strange calm. Watching him sit there in the waiting area, whispering in Evelyn's ear, brushing invisible dust from his jacket, I realized this was not over. This was only the beginning. The following days unfolded in a haze of exhaustion and suspicion. The police questioned us again, this time more pointedly, asking about the open doors, about the sequence of shots, about the way Daniel had positioned himself during the attack. I repeated my story, emphasizing how he had refused to close the doors and ordered everyone to stay seated. The detective nodded but warned me that without clear evidence it would be difficult to prove intent. The shooter had escaped into the woods beyond the property, leaving behind nothing but shattered windows and bullet casings. No fingerprints, no identification, just the terror he left stamped on our memories. Still, I could not shake the image of Daniel's face during the chaos, that absence of fear, that calculated calm. It was not the face of a man caught in danger, but of a man watching a plan unfold. At the hospital, relatives whispered in hallways. Some believed me, their eyes wide with the same unease I carried, but others muttered that I was exaggerating, that grief had clouded my judgment. Daniel played his role masterfully, walking the halls with Evelyn at his side, speaking to officers with controlled politeness, offering reassurances to frightened cousins. He framed himself as the steady hand in a storm, the only one who had kept people from panicking. Some family members even thanked him, praising his composure. Each word of gratitude felt like a dagger to me. My mother avoided confrontation, repeating that she only wanted peace. Mark was torn, his voice shaky whenever I pressed him. He admitted he had felt Daniel's command like a chain around his neck, but he was too frightened to say it publicly. The divide deepened when Daniel began quietly suggesting that I had lost control, that my actions had endangered others by leading them outside, where the shooter could have easily struck. Evelyn echoed him, telling anyone who would listen that I had overreacted. The lawyer who had been present tried to defend me, admitting that Daniel's behavior was unusual, but his voice was drowned in the sea of family politics. The community was buzzing with rumors. The local paper printed a front-page story about violence at a will reading, splashing our family name across headlines. Neighbors speculated in hushed voices at grocery stores, their eyes lingering on me with curiosity and suspicion. Strangers posted online, dissecting every scrap of information they could find. Some portrayed us as victims, others hinted at scandal. Through it all, Daniel thrived, weaving himself into interviews, casting doubt on my credibility. He described me as emotional, unstable, still grieving too deeply to see things clearly. Evelyn backed him with teary eyes and trembling words, claiming that I had misunderstood his intentions. It was unbearable. At night, I lay awake, replaying the moment over and over, the smell of gunpowder, the ringing in my ears, Daniel's voice commanding us to sit. Each time, the memory grew sharper until it felt carved into my skull. I knew what I had seen. I knew what he had done, and I knew that silence would let him win. Yet I also knew that speaking louder would make me his target. The family was splitting in two, those who believed me and those who clung to Daniel's facade of control. The fault line widened with each passing day, and I could feel the ground trembling beneath us. As the weeks stretched on, the Carter family became a battlefield without weapons, but with wounds that cut just as deep. Family dinners turned into interrogations where every glance was a judgment and every word a veiled accusation. When I entered a room, conversations would falter, and eyes would shift toward Daniel as if waiting for his cue on how to react. He never disappointed. With that same measured voice, he would sigh and remark how difficult grief was on people who lacked stability. It was always directed at me without naming me, a dagger hidden in polite phrasing. Some cousins nodded along, their fear of him stronger than their loyalty to truth. My mother tried to keep peace by cooking elaborate meals as if food could patch over suspicion, but her trembling hands betrayed her. Mark grew quieter by the day, avoiding eye contact with me. His loyalty tangled between truth and fear. Evelyn became Daniel's shadow, her body rigid, her eyes hollow. Whenever I tried to speak to her alone, she would flinch as though I were striking her. She whispered once that Daniel only wanted what was best for the family and then scurried away, her words sounding rehearsed, her lips quivering. The lawyer who had handled the will called me privately, his voice tense. He told me Daniel had been asking probing questions about assets, about property still unsettled. The lawyer found it odd that Daniel was so invested when technically none of it belonged to him. That phone call fueled the storm inside me. I confronted my mother, demanding she acknowledge what we all knew, that Daniel was manipulating Evelyn and the family for inheritance. But she shook her head, tears welling, whispering that survival sometimes meant compromise. I snapped at her anger, breaking through my exhaustion. Survival for who? For him, for Evelyn. What about us? My words echoed harshly in the kitchen, but she said nothing more. The community's perception grew uglier. Rumors painted me as unstable, even dangerous, a woman desperate for attention, by accusing her brother-in-law of conspiracy. Daniel fed those rumors by presenting himself as the calm patriarch filling the void my father had left. He attended church services with a solemn face, shook hands at community events, spoke of unity and family resilience, while ensuring whispers of my supposed hysteria spread through town. The isolation was suffocating. Old friends stopped returning calls, neighbors crossed the street rather than meet my eyes. Even some relatives began suggesting quietly that maybe I should step back from family affairs, that my presence was stirring unnecessary tension. But beneath their words, I recognized Daniel's influence, his manipulation seeping into every corner of our lives. Yet with every attempt to silence me, my determination hardened. I began keeping detailed notes of everything, times, places, words spoken. I documented the look on Daniel's face when the gunfire began, the precise moments he blocked the doors, the way he discouraged movement toward safety. I knew evidence mattered more than conviction alone. But with each page I filled, the risk deepened. Daniel was watching me more closely now, his smile tight whenever our eyes met. He was aware that I was not breaking. That realization was both terrifying and empowering. The family was turning, yes, but I was not alone. A small cluster of relatives believed me, their loyalty quiet but steady. The lawyer, too, seemed uneasy with Daniel's growing authority. Even Mark, hesitant as he was, showed flashes of resolve when no one else was watching. The conflict was tearing us apart, but in the cracks of division, I began to see the possibility of exposing him. The breaking point came one evening when I was sitting in my apartment, the pile of notes scattered across my kitchen table, when my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. It was a grainy video file. My fingers shook as I pressed play. The screen lit up with chaotic images, the camera unsteady, but the sounds were unmistakable. The deafening cracks of gunfire, the screams, the clatter of furniture. The angle shifted, and there was Daniel standing tall at the open doors, his hand gripping the frame, his face disturbingly calm. The voice of my cousin, shaky and muffled, whispered into the phone's microphone. "He's not even trying to protect us. He's letting them in." The footage cut off abruptly, but it was enough. Proof. Evidence that Daniel had not only refused to act, but had stood firm against anyone else closing those doors. My heart pounded as adrenaline surged. I called the detective immediately, my words tumbling over each other as I explained what I had received. He told me to come to the station. That night, I handed over the video, watching as the detective replayed it again and again, his face tightening with each loop. He finally admitted it was compelling, that it changed things. But still, he warned Daniel's defense would be that he was trying to maintain order, that the video was ambiguous. I clenched my fists, furious at the possibility of ambiguity, when the truth was so clear to me. A few days later, the footage leaked online. No one admitted to sharing it, but I suspected the cousin who had filmed it wanted the truth out as much as I did. The video spread fast, picked up by local news, then national outlets. Headlines screamed about conspiracy at a will reading, about family betrayal, about a brother-in-law who might have aided a shooter. Suddenly, the whispers that had painted me hysterical turned into questions about Daniel. Reporters camped outside Evelyn's home, cameras flashing as she tried to drive away. For the first time, Daniel's control faltered. At the next family gathering, he exploded in anger, slamming his fist against the table, accusing me of destroying the family. His mask slipped, and in that slip, I saw the man I had always known. The man of cruelty, of manipulation, of violence, cloaked in charm. Evelyn flinched at his outburst, her eyes wide, her lips trembling. I realized then that even she was beginning to see the cracks. The police summoned Daniel for further questioning this time with sharper focus. They pressed him on his refusal to close the doors on his commands to keep everyone seated on his lack of fear during the attack. He denied everything, claimed the video was taken out of context, insisted he had acted in everyone's best interest. But his calm facade was no longer enough. Suspicion had taken root. Family members who once praised his composure now whispered doubts. The same cousins who had thanked him for keeping order now avoided his eyes. The tide was turning. At night, I lay awake not with fear but with anticipation. For the first time since that horrible day, I felt the weight of isolation lift. My truth was finally piercing through his web of lies. Yet I knew Daniel would not go quietly. His power had always relied on control, and as it slipped away, he would grow more dangerous. Still, I pressed forward. I gave interviews, spoke directly to reporters, my voice steady as I recounted every detail. I refused to be silenced, and each time I spoke, Evelyn watched from the background, her face unreadable, but her eyes lingering on me longer than before. There was a shift in her, small but real. The truth was emerging, and with it the possibility of justice. The video had ripped open the careful veil Daniel had woven for years, and suddenly our family's tragedy was no longer confined to whispered arguments or courtroom proceedings, but plastered across every news channel and social media feed. Reporters called it the funeral shooting scandal, and though the label made me wince, I understood the weight it carried. Everywhere I went, people recognized my face, some offering sympathy, others curiosity, still others doubt. But the point was clear: the narrative was no longer controlled by Daniel. The courtroom became the stage where everything would be decided. The district attorney announced formal charges of conspiracy and reckless endangerment, citing the video as key evidence. When Daniel was escorted into the courthouse dressed in his immaculate suit and still wearing that air of defiance, the crowd outside erupted in shouts. Some screamed for justice, others hurled insults. Cameras flashed endlessly as if capturing the moment evil itself had been dragged into daylight. Evelyn walked beside him, pale and tight-lipped, her gaze fixed on the ground. Inside, the atmosphere was electric. The prosecution presented the video, first playing it on a large screen. The room filled with the sounds that still haunted me: the gunfire, the screams, Daniel's chilling composure as he held the doors open. Gasps spread through the spectators. Journalists scribbled furiously. The lawyer who had sat beside us that day testified next, recounting Daniel's refusal to close the doors and his insistence on keeping people seated even as the chaos unfolded. My own testimony followed, and though my voice trembled at first, I steadied it, forcing each word out with clarity. I described the terror, the cries of the children, the moment I realized Daniel was not a protector, but a predator who had orchestrated our entrapment. Daniel's defense tried to dismiss me as emotional, unhinged by grief, but the weight of the evidence pressed harder than his words could deflect. Then came the most unexpected moment. Evelyn took the stand. She walked with hesitation, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. For years she had defended him, had repeated his lies with conviction. But that day, something in her had shifted. Her voice quivered as she admitted that Daniel had spoken of inheritance in the days leading up to the will reading, that he had muttered late at night about making sure things fell into the right hands. She confessed that though she had wanted to believe him deep down, she had been afraid. When she broke down in tears and whispered that Daniel had warned her not to interfere with his decisions, the courtroom fell silent. It was the crack in his armor that no amount of rehearsed calm could mend. Daniel erupted in fury, shouting that she was a liar, that she was weak, that she had betrayed him. Bailiffs restrained him as the judge pounded the gavel for order. That moment, captured by every camera in the room, destroyed whatever remained of his facade. The trial continued each day, unraveling more of his schemes. Financial records showed he had contacted dubious associates in the weeks before the attack. Phone records hinted at calls with a number linked to a known criminal. Though the shooter himself had not been caught, the threads tied back to Daniel were undeniable. When the verdict was finally read, the room held its breath. Guilty on all counts. The words echoed like a cleansing bell, releasing a weight that had smothered us for too long. Tears streamed down my mother's face as she clutched my hand. Mark exhaled a sob that shook his whole body. The cousins who had once doubted me turned with apology in their eyes. Justice had been spoken, but it was not only the court's judgment that mattered. It was the public reckoning. Newspapers declared the downfall of a manipulative man who had tried to turn grief into greed. Commentators called me resilient, a woman who refused to be silenced. Strangers wrote letters thanking me for speaking up, telling me my courage had inspired them to confront their own toxic family dynamics. Yet beneath the validation lay a sobering truth. Justice was not victory, but survival. Our family was scarred, fractured by betrayal. Evelyn withdrew from public life, seeking quiet far away from the shadows of her husband. My mother leaned on me more than ever, her health fragile, but her spirit slowly mending. I returned home each night exhausted but resolute, knowing that though the fight had left me bruised, it had also forged me stronger. Daniel had thought he could manipulate the world into submission, but in the end, his arrogance had been his undoing. The doors he had left open at that will reading had become the doors through which truth entered, unstoppable and undeniable. In the weeks after the trial, the noise of media slowly faded, though echoes remained in quiet corners of town. People still whispered when I passed, but the whispers no longer carried suspicion. They carried recognition, sometimes pity, sometimes admiration, and most importantly, they carried the truth. My father's house felt different when I visited its walls still scarred by bullets, its silence heavy, but it was no longer haunted by Daniel's shadow. We had changed the locks, replaced the shattered glass, scrubbed the bloodstains until only faint reminders lingered. Yet inside me the healing was slower. Nights were restless, the sound of gunfire replaying in my mind, jolting me awake with my heart pounding. I started therapy speaking aloud the things I had buried in silence for too long. My therapist told me trauma bends but does not have to break, that reclaiming my voice had been my first act of recovery. I clung to that thought when the darkness pressed too close. My mother, frail but resilient, began gardening again, her hands trembling less as she tended flowers. Mark finally looked me in the eye without flinching, his voice steadier as he apologized for doubting me, admitting he had been too afraid to challenge Daniel's grip. That apology, simple and raw, mended a fracture between us that I had feared was permanent. Evelyn was harder to reach. She moved away quietly, leaving only a brief note that she needed space to rebuild. In it, she thanked me for standing up, confessing that my courage had helped her find her own. Though her absence ached, I understood. She needed distance to discover who she was without Daniel's control. I hoped one day she would heal free from the chains that had bound her for so long. The inheritance, once the source of division, now seemed almost irrelevant. The money and property were redistributed according to my father's wishes, but no one celebrated. Wealth had cost us dearly, exposing greed that nearly destroyed us. What mattered now was survival, rebuilding the family that remained. I looked at the next generation, the children who had screamed in that room, and I vowed they would grow up knowing strength rather than fear, truth rather than silence. Reflection came quietly in the evenings when I sat by the window watching the sunset cast fire across the sky. I thought of my father, of the legacy he had wanted for us, and I wondered if he would have been proud. I thought of Daniel, locked away, still dangerous, but stripped of power, his name now synonymous with betrayal. Most of all, I thought of myself, the woman who had been dismissed as hysterical, who had been isolated and doubted, yet who had refused to bow. I had faced not only a man, but a system of silence, and I had broken it. Healing did not mean forgetting. Healing meant carrying scars and still moving forward. It meant recognizing that the undulation of grief and rage and hope had carved me into someone new, someone stronger. As I closed my eyes each night, I whispered a promise to myself: never again would I let anyone lock me in the prison of their control. The doors that had once been left open to violence were now closed, forever sealed by the resolve that I would live free, I would live true, and I would never be silenced again. Daniel's sentencing day drew crowds to the courthouse once more, though this time the air was not thick with fear but with anticipation. The judge delivered a lengthy speech condemning Daniel for betraying not only his family, but the trust of an entire community. When the sentence was announced, decades in prison without chance of early release, the room erupted in gasps and murmurs. Some cheered quietly, others wept, but all felt the gravity of justice being sealed. Daniel stood rigid, his jaw clenched, his eyes darting toward me with venom. It was the last shred of power he tried to hold, that silent glare meant to intimidate, but it no longer pierced me. He was no longer the master of the room, no longer the man weaving lies that ensnared us. He was a criminal stripped of influence, reduced to a cautionary tale. Evelyn did not attend the sentencing. She had already filed for divorce, her attorney citing years of emotional coercion and manipulation. She sold their house, moved to another state, and began volunteering at a shelter for women escaping abuse. I heard through relatives that she was finding purpose again, her voice steadier each day. It was a bittersweet relief knowing she had broken free, but also knowing it had taken devastation to get there. The family fractured permanently. Some cousins stopped speaking altogether, ashamed of how they had sided with Daniel. Others tried to mend fences, but the scars were too deep. Holiday gatherings shrank the once bustling Carter home, now hosting only a small circle of those who had survived both bullets and betrayal. My mother, once desperate for peace at any cost, admitted she had learned the hardest truth of all, that silence only feeds cruelty. She began speaking openly about what happened, sharing her story at church groups, encouraging others never to let fear stop them from confronting abuse. Her courage grew alongside mine, and in that shared strength we found new closeness. The town itself carried the imprint of the scandal. People whispered about the funeral shooting for months, then years, retelling it as both tragedy and warning. Schools and churches started drills, community groups discussed inheritance planning with transparency, all because our story had revealed the dangers of secrecy and greed. Daniel's name became synonymous with selfishness and betrayal, a reminder of how one man's hunger for control nearly destroyed an entire family. I, too, carried consequences, though of a different kind. The experience hardened me, sharpened my instincts. I returned to work with a new sense of purpose, mentoring young women about resilience, speaking at conferences about family dynamics and survival. Each time I stood before an audience, I thought of that day, the doors open, the shots echoing, and how close we had come to being silenced forever. Instead, we had turned it into a story of exposure, of justice. Yet I did not sugarcoat it. I told the truth. Justice had cost us dearly. It had left scars that would never fully fade. But in exposing Daniel, we had also exposed a truth larger than him, that no one, no matter how charming or powerful, can hold an entire family hostage forever. Consequences ripple outward, touching everyone, shaping futures. Daniel paid with his freedom. Evelyn paid with years of her life. We paid with trust, broken beyond repair. But we also gained clarity, courage, and a vow that the Carter family would never again be silent in the face of danger. Looking back now, I see that my father's will reading was never just about inheritance, but about revealing the truth of who we were as a family and who among us carried poison in their hearts. Daniel thought he could twist grief into opportunity, that he could hold doors open for violence, and still convince the world he was a savior. He underestimated me. He underestimated the power of truth, of persistence, of refusing to bow to fear. The journey from that terrifying day to the courtroom verdict carved me open, broke me down, and forced me to rebuild. I was not the same woman who sat trembling at that long oak table when the shots rang out. I had become someone forged by fire, someone who learned that silence is not peace, that compliance is not survival, and that courage is often born from the very moments when your voice shakes. To those listening, I want to say this: families can be beautiful, but they can also be prisons. Blood ties do not excuse cruelty. Tradition does not justify abuse. If you feel trapped, unheard, manipulated, know that you are not alone. I was dismissed as hysterical, branded unstable, shunned by those who feared rocking the boat. Yet truth has a way of breaking through, even when it feels the world is deaf to your cries. Keep records, hold on to evidence, find allies even if they are few. Most of all, do not let the person who controls through fear convince you that your resistance is weakness. It is strength. Healing is not quick and it is not simple. There are still nights I wake drenched in sweat, still sounds that jolt me back into that room. But healing is also walking forward anyway, carrying the scars as proof not of what was done to you, but of what you survived. Justice may not come neatly. It may not heal every wound or restore every relationship. My family will never be whole again. The empty chairs at gatherings remind us of loss of betrayal, of what greed and control can destroy. Yet even fractured, we are stronger than we were because the truth is no longer hidden. My father's legacy was not the money or the property. It was the reminder that character matters, that strength is measured not by dominance but by integrity. I choose to honor him not by clinging to what was taken, but by building something new, something honest. To those who find themselves surrounded by toxic family, I tell you this: you have the right to stand up, to speak out, to protect yourself, even when those you love turn against you. Do not wait for permission to survive. Do not wait for someone else to close the doors for you. If you see danger, call it out. If you see manipulation, expose it. And when the world tells you to be quiet, to keep peace, to accept abuse as the cost of belonging, remember my story. Remember that courage may isolate you at first, but in the end, it gathers strength around it. My name is Rachel Carter. I was nearly silenced at my father's will reading, but today I am not silent. Today I am a voice that no bullet and no lie could destroy. And if you are listening, know this: you too can find your voice. You too can stand against the darkness, and you too can choose to lock the doors that others would leave open to harm.